They say the heart is the last thing to stop, but in my experience, it's the eyes that witness the end of the world first. I spent 40 years as a district attorney, staring into the souls of the city's most depraved predators, looking for the tiny fractures in their stories that would lead to a conviction. I was a man of the law, a man of logic, a man who believed that the truth was always hidden in the fine print if you looked hard enough. I never imagined that the most lethal contract I would ever overlook was the marriage certificate tucked away in my own desk drawer. The hospital room smelled of dying lilies and the sharp metallic tang of blood that always seems to linger in the air of the intensive care unit. I was conscious, a fact that would have horrified the two people standing at the foot of my bed. I was a prisoner in a glass coffin of my own skin, my body rendered immobile by what the doctors called a sudden and catastrophic cardiac event. My eyes were half-lidded, fixed on the flickering fluorescent light in the ceiling that hummed with a maddening, low-frequency buzz. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move a finger. I couldn't even weep, though my soul was screaming with a volume that should have shattered the windows. Isabella was there, my wife of 3 years. She was 38, a former caregiver who had walked into my life after the long, agonizing death of my first wife, Eleanor. I thought she was a miracle. I thought the soft glow of her smile was the reward for a lifetime of service to a cold and ungrateful city. But as I lay there, helpless, she wasn't holding my hand. She wasn't whispering words of comfort or praying for my recovery. She was holding a designer handbag and looking at me with the same clinical detachment a butcher might show a side of beef. "Is the insurance policy definitely active, Victor?" Isabella asked. Her voice was a sharp, jagged contrast to the hushed, honeyed tones she had used for years. The sweetness was gone, replaced by a cold, transactional steel that made my skin crawl. "It's solid, Bella," a man replied. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Victor, her cousin. At least, that's who she told me he was when she insisted I hire him as our estate manager. I had trusted him with the keys to my kingdom because I trusted her. The lawyer confirmed the accidental death clause doubles the payout if he passes within 48 hours of the initial event. Victor continued.
"The doctor is in the hallway, signing the DNR order as we speak. He's 90% gone, Isabella. The brain activity is a flat line, according to the monitors they're looking at. By tomorrow afternoon, we'll be liquidating the Sterling accounts and moving the deeds." "Are you sure about the daughter?" Isabella asked, her heels clicking on the linoleum as she paced. "She's been calling the nurses' station every hour. She's going to want an autopsy." "Let her want it," Victor said with a dismissive grunt. "The toxicology won't show anything but a standard heart failure. We were careful with the dosage, weren't we? Besides, you have the power of attorney. You've already restricted her access. She's nothing but a nuisance now." I tried to scream. I tried to shatter the glass of my paralysis, to heave my chest and wrap my hands around Victor's throat until the truth was choked out of him. But my body was a leaden weight, a sarcophagus of bone and failed nerves. I was forced to watch through the slit of my eyes as Isabella pulled a glossy magazine from her bag. She sat in the vinyl chair, the one meant for grieving relatives, and flipped the pages with a bored, rhythmic flick of her wrist. She stopped at a spread of high-end wedding dresses. "Look at this Vera Wang, Victor," she giggled. The sound was like a razor blade against my ears. It was the same giggle she had used on our honeymoon in Paris. "White might be a bit much for a grieving widow, but I've always wanted a summer wedding in Tuscany. We can use the funeral fund for the deposit on the villa. I mean, it's not like he needs a mahogany casket. He won't know the difference once the lid is closed." I wasn't even cold yet, and she was already fitting herself for my replacement ceremony. I sat there, a ghost with a heartbeat, listening to my wife pick out her next wedding dress while my own pulse was still showing on the monitor. If you've ever felt the sting of a loved one sharpening the knife they plan to put in your back, hit that subscribe button. You need to see how I turned my own funeral into their living hell. The betrayal was a physical ache, worse than the crushing weight that had flattened my chest during the heart attack. I remembered the tea she brought me every single night, the slightly bitter aftertaste I had dismissed as some herbal health blend she'd found at the market. She hadn't just waited for me to die.
She had orchestrated the collapse, brick by brick, dose by dose.
Every I love you was a line in a ledger. Every kiss was a measurement for my coffin. The house sells next, Isabella said, her thumb tracing the lace on the magazine page. I'm tired of this place, Victor. I'm tired of the smell of old wood, dusty law books, and history. I want glass. I want a penthouse in the city where I can look down on everyone. I want something that doesn't remind me of him or that pathetic first wife of his. You're cold, Bella, Victor laughed. I like it, but we need to stay the course. The doctor will be back in 10 minutes to finalize the paperwork. We should look properly devastated. Isabella stood up and walked over to the mirror on the wall. She adjusted her hair, wiped a stray smudge of lipstick, and then practiced a look of profound, soul-shattering grief in the glass. She actually squeezed a tear out, watching it roll down her cheek with an artist's precision. There, she said, her voice returning to that soft, deceptive purr. Is that enough for the cameras? Perfect, Victor replied. Let's go get some air. I can't stand the smell of this room. They walked out, leaving me in the silence of the flickering light and the humming machines. I retreated into the only place they couldn't reach, my mind. I was a prosecutor. I had spent my life building cases out of whispers and shadows. If my heart was still beating, it was for a reason. I focused all my Navy training, all my legal grit, into one single primal command: move. I didn't try to move my arms. I didn't try to sit up. I went for the smallest, most significant gesture a man can make. I focused on my left eyelid. I felt the weight of the sedatives they were pumping into my IV, the thick, syrupy fog that was meant to keep me under. I fought it. I visualized the muscle, the tiny nerve endings. I pushed against the darkness. By the time the night nurse came in, Victor and Isabella had left to go grieve at a 5-star steakhouse down the street. The room was dark, save for the glow of the heart monitor. The nurse was a young woman named Sarah. She had been the only one who didn't talk over me as if I were a piece of furniture. She had always treated me with a quiet dignity, humming soft tunes while she checked the bags. She leaned over to check my pupils with a small penlight. I know you're in there, Mr. Thorne, she whispered. I froze, or as much as a paralyzed man can freeze. Her voice was a tremor of hope in a room full of ghosts.
I saw your heart rate spike when they were talking earlier, she continued, her voice so low it was barely a breath. I've seen enough patients like you to know when the machines are telling the whole story. My grandfather was one of the men you helped back in the 90s, during that housing scam case. You saved our family home, Elias. I haven't forgotten. She looked toward the door, then leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. If you can hear me, blink. Just once. I need to know before they come back to sign the final papers. I poured every ounce of my soul, every memory of Eleanor, every bit of my desire for justice into my eyelids. Click. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. Tears welled in her eyes. Oh, thank God, she breathed. Listen to me, Elias. I don't have much time. I'm not on their payroll, and I know what they're doing. I've seen Isabella talking to Dr. Eris in the lounge. Money changed hands. They think you're a flat line, but I'm going to change your chart. I'm going to adjust the dosage of the paralytic. She fumbled with the IV drip, her fingers moving with a frantic, desperate speed. I'm going to wake you up, but you have to play the part. You have to be a ghost for a little longer. If they know you're awake, they'll find another way to finish it. We need to trap them. Can you do that, Elias? Can you be a ghost until we can get the evidence? I blinked again, twice this time. Good, she said, wiping her eyes. I'm going to call your daughter from a burner phone. She's the only one who can contest the DNR once we have proof of consciousness. But for now, when Isabella comes back, you have to stay still, no matter what she says, no matter what she does. Do you understand? I blinked once. The war had begun. For the next hour, I lay there as the saline began to flush the poison from my system. I felt the first prickle of sensation in my fingertips, like 1,000 needles being driven into my skin. It was agony, but it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. It was the feeling of life returning to a dead man. When the door opened again, Isabella walked in alone. She had a glass of wine in her hand, likely swiped from the steakhouse. She walked over to the bed and stared down at me. The grief was gone, the tears were gone. There was only a cold, predatory triumph. You really were so easy, Elias, she whispered, reaching out to stroke my forehead with a hand that felt like ice.
You spent your whole life looking for the bad guys, and you never realized you were sleeping next to one. Don't worry. The Tuscany wedding is going to be beautiful. I'll think of you when I'm walking down the aisle in that Vera Wang. It's a shame, really. If you hadn't been so rich, I might have actually liked you. She leaned down and kissed my cheek. It was a dry, hollow kiss. The kiss of a spider. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let my breathing stay shallow and mechanical. I watched her through the slits of my eyes as she walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, already spending the money she hadn't yet inherited. She thought she was looking at her future. She didn't realize she was looking at her epitaph. The monitor beeped a steady, mocking rhythm in the background. Sarah had rigged the display to show a failing heart, a dying signal that would satisfy the crooked doctor and the greedy wife. I felt the strength gathering in my jaw, the slow, steady return of my pulse. I wasn't just Elias Thorne, the retired district attorney, anymore. I was a hunter. I was the one in the shadows now. I was the monster under her bed, and she was the one who had invited me in. Isabella turned back to me, her face silhouetted against the moonlight. She looked radiant, a black widow in her element. "See you in the next life, Elias," she said, raising her glass in a mock toast. The door clicked shut as she left to find Victor and the doctor. I lay there in the dark, the flickering light above me finally going still. The hum of the room seemed to shift, the frequency of my existence sharpening into a single focused point of vengeance. I looked at the shadow of the lilies on the wall, their long, jagged shapes looking like the bars of the cell I was building for her. The silence of the hospital was no longer a weight, it was a weapon. I was a ghost with a heartbeat, and the haunting was only just beginning. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of Sarah's footsteps returning down the hall, the only sound of truth in a building full of lies. The eyes were open now, and the eyes had seen everything. My hand, hidden beneath the heavy white sheets, twitched with the first real spark of life, a silent promise of the storm that was coming for them both. I watched the red light of the heart monitor pulse against the dark mahogany of the ward door, a ticking clock that Isabella didn't know was counting down to her own destruction.
The silence of a graveyard is a peaceful thing, a soft blanket of finality that covers the weary. But the silence of a man who is legally dead while his heart is still beating is a roar that never stops. For 2 weeks I lived as a phantom in a world of white sheets and clinical indifference, a ghost haunting the very bed I was expected to die in. "Sarah, your shift started 10 minutes ago," I thought, as I heard the familiar squeak of her soft-soled shoes against the linoleum. I kept my breathing shallow, my jaw slightly slack, my eyes fixed on that same humming fluorescent light. It was a performance that required every ounce of my district attorney training. I had to be the perfect victim, a motionless witness to my own erasure. Sarah leaned over me, her breath warm against my ear as she adjusted the IV bag. I felt the cool rush of saline replacing the syrupy fog of the sedatives Isabella had been slipping into my veins. "Are you with me, Elias?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. I waited until I heard the heavy click of the ward door's lock. I let my eyes clear, the focus returning to the room. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one that felt like it belonged to me in months. "I'm here, Sarah," I rasped. My voice sounded like a shovel scraping against dry earth. It hurt to speak, but the pain was a luxury. It meant I was real. "How much time do we have?" "The doctor is doing his rounds in the east wing," she said, her eyes darting toward the small glass window in the door. "Isabella and Victor are at the house. They brought in a team of decorators today. They're calling it staging.
They're clearing out your library, Elias. They told the staff you won't be needing the books where you're going. My library, I whispered, a spark of heat lighting up in my chest. 40 years of law, of history, of Eleanor's favorite first editions. They're gutting the house before the body is even cold. They're moving you to the hospice facility in the morning, Sarah said, her hands trembling as she checked my pulse. Victor owns a silence stake in it. Once you're through those doors, Elias, I won't be able to get to you. The staff there is handpicked. Then we have to end this tonight, I said. I felt the strength returning to my fingers, the needles and pins of circulation finally giving way to a steady rhythmic throb. Did you reach him? Marcus is coming, she nodded. He's listed as a palliative care consultant. He should be here any minute.
Elias, are you sure about this? If they catch you, if the doctor sees you're lucid before we're ready. I spent 40 years staring down murderers in suits, Sarah, I told her, my eyes narrowing. Isabella is just a common thief who happens to look good in a sundress. I've survived the Navy and the mob. I'm not letting a professional widow take my name. The door opened, and a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped in. Marcus hadn't aged a day in a decade, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes behind his spectacles as sharp as the day we won our first RICO case together. He carried a leather briefcase like a shield. "Elias, you old shark," Marcus breathed, leaning close to the bed. Sarah stepped back, playing the part of the busy nurse. "I thought we were actually going to be burying you this time. I've already got the eulogy half written." "Save it for the wedding, Marcus," I croaked. "What did you find?" "Everything," he said, popping the latches on his briefcase. "Isabella is a piece of work, or should I say, Elena Rossi." Elena Rossi. I repeated the name, the syllables tasting like ash. "She's a pro, Elias," Marcus said, sliding a folder onto the bed. "She's done this twice before, once in Boca, once in Naples. Wealthy widowers, sudden cardiac events, contested wills that somehow always ended in her favor. She's a professional widow. And Victor, he isn't her cousin. He's her partner in every sense of the word. They've been running this circuit for 10 years. I looked at the photos in the folder. Isabella on a boat in Florida. Isabella at a funeral in a different black veil. The woman I had shared my bed with was a fabrication, a character played by a monster. "And the money?" I asked. "Victor's been busy," Marcus replied, his voice a low growl. "He didn't just manage the estate, he bled it. I found a ledger, Elias. He's embezzled over $3 million into a shell company in the Caymans. They've already filed the preliminary probate. Isabella thinks she's won. She's actually hosting a commitment ceremony at the house in 3 days. A celebration of life and new beginnings, she calls it. She's invited the whole board of the Law Association. A ceremony, I said, a slow, cold grin spreading across my face. She wants a public triumph. She wants the city to witness her becoming the queen of the Thorne estate. Elias, we can take this to the police now," Marcus said. "We have enough to halt the probate."
"No," I said, my voice gaining strength, the prosecutor in me rising from the dead. "That's too clean. They didn't just steal money, Marcus. They stole my dignity. They treated me like a piece of furniture they could push into a dark corner. I want them to lose everything in front of the very people they're trying to impress. I want the moment they think they are untouchable to be the moment the floor disappears." "What do you need?" Marcus asked. "I need a camera," I said. "I need the hidden ones I had installed in the library back in '85 to be activated. Isabella never found the override in the false wall. And I need Sarah to give me the recording she took." "I have it right here," Sarah said, tapping her pocket. "The one where they discussed the insurance and the wedding dress while you were lying right there." "Good," I said. "And Marcus, I need a front row seat to that wedding." The next 78 hours were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I lay in that bed, letting Isabella stroke my hair with her cold, murderous hands while she talked about how much she would miss me. I watched Victor stand at the window, checking his watch, waiting for the doctor to call the time of death. They treated me like a corpse, talking about my life in the past tense while I was right in front of them. "You're doing so well, Elias," Isabella whispered on the final night, leaning down to kiss my forehead. Her breath smelled of expensive wine and triumph. "Tomorrow, you'll be in a much quieter place. I've picked out the most beautiful spot for you. You'll be able to see the water. It's what you would have wanted." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I let her walk out, her heels clicking a celebratory rhythm on the tiles. The day of the ceremony arrived like a fever dream.
Sarah helped me into the back of Marcus's blacked-out SUV in the early hours of the morning, moving me through the service entrance of the hospital. By the time the doctor realized my bed was empty, I was already at the house, tucked away in the one place Isabella had never explored, the library's hidden annex behind the false wall of law journals. I sat in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of old paper and leather. I had a tablet in my hand, showing me every angle of the ballroom. The Thorne estate had been turned into a floral nightmare, white roses everywhere, silk drapes. It looked like a temple built to honor a lie. I watched the guests arrive. Judges I had worked with for decades, the mayor,
My old colleagues from the DA's office. They all looked somber, shaking Victor's hand, offering Isabella their condolences for my decline. Isabella was radiant. She was wearing the Vera Wang dress I had heard her pick out in the hospital. She looked like the perfect, tragic bride, a woman whose heart was breaking even as she prepared for a new beginning. Victor stood beside her, wearing one of my custom suits, looking every bit the master of the house. To Elias, Victor toasted, raising a crystal flute of my finest champagne as the ceremony began. The ballroom was packed, the air thick with the scent of lilies and high society. May he finally find the peace he deserves, and may we carry his legacy forward with the dignity it demands. The crowd cheered. Isabella leaned in, her eyes wet with practiced tears, and whispered something in Victor's ear before they turned for their first dance. That was the trigger. I didn't walk out yet. I hit the master override on the house's integrated theater system. The upbeat jazz music died instantly, replaced by a harsh, jarring static that made the guests wince. The massive dual screens at the end of the ballroom, which had been showing a soft focus montage of my life, suddenly flickered and changed. The image was grainy, taken from a low angle. It was the hospital room. "Is Isabella?" Victor's voice boomed through the ballroom's high-end speakers, a jagged, cold sound that froze every person in their tracks. "Is the insurance policy definitely active?" Isabella's face on the screen, looking at a wedding magazine. "The accidental death clause doubles the payout," her voice echoed, clear and murderous. I wasn't even cold yet, Victor. White might be too much for a widow, but I've always wanted a summer wedding in Tuscany. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence I used to find in the center of a high-security vault. Isabella's hand froze midair, her champagne glass tilting, the vintage liquid dripping on her white lace dress like blood. Then the screen shifted again. A Florida mugshot of Elena Rossi, her criminal record scrolling in high-definition text next to her current, horrified face. The embezzlement ledgers, the shell company transfers, every dirty secret, every stolen cent, laid bare in front of the city's most powerful people. I stepped out of the library annex, the heavy oak doors swinging open with a thud that felt like a gavel striking the bench. I wasn't in a hospital gown.
I wasn't paralyzed. I was in my finest navy pinstripe suit, my silver hair brushed back, my eyes burning with the cold, focused fire of 1,000 closing arguments. I walked onto the balcony overlooking the ballroom, my hands gripping the mahogany rail. "I believe there's been a mistake in the fine print, Isabella," I said, my voice projected through every speaker in the house. Isabella's face didn't just go pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray. She looked at me, her mouth working like a landed fish. Then she looked at the screens, then back at me. She dropped her crystal flute. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a pathetic, broken squeak. You're supposed to be dead," I finished for her, walking down the grand staircase with a steady, purposeful gait. Every step felt like a reclamation of the earth I stood on. "I've been dead before, Isabella. It didn't stick. But your freedom, that's about to have a very short shelf life." The guests recoiled from her as if she were a leper. The mayor, a man I had known for 30 years, stepped back with a look of pure disgust. The socialites who had been offering her comfort only minutes ago now looked at her like a stain on the floor. Marcus stepped from the crowd, flanked by 2 detectives I had trained myself. "Elena Rossi, Victor Vance," Marcus said,
his voice echoing with a grim satisfaction. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and grand larceny." Isabella tried to run. She gathered the heavy silk of that Vera Wang dress in her hands and tried to bolt for the garden doors, but she tripped on the long, expensive train. She fell hard onto the marble, the lace tearing, her tiara skittering across the floor. Victor didn't even try to help her. He stood there, his hands in the air, the cowardice finally showing in the set of his shoulders. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking down at her as she sprawled on the floor. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel hatred. I felt the cold, spiritual peace of a man who has finally righted the scales. "The house stays with the family, Isabella," I said softly, the silence in the room so deep you could hear the distant sirens of the approaching police cars. "The money stays in the trust, and you stay in a cell." I watched as the detectives hauled them up. I watched the handcuffs click shut, the metal bright against the white of her wedding dress.
The sirens outside grew louder, a wailing symphony of accountability that was finally coming for them both. Isabella looked at me one last time, her eyes full of a frantic, feral terror, before she was led away into the night. The guests began to filter out, their faces full of shock and hushed whispers. I didn't stop them. I didn't need their apologies or their questions. I walked back up the stairs, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm that finally felt like my own. I went into my study and closed the heavy oak door. The room was silent, smelling of cedar and old books. I walked over to my desk and looked at the silver-framed photo of Eleanor. I sat down in my leather chair, the one that Isabella had called a dusty relic. I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the bottle of vintage scotch I had been saving for my 85th birthday. I poured a single glass, the amber liquid catching the light of the setting sun. I took a sip, the warmth settling in my chest like a long-awaited homecoming. Justice isn't just a word carved into the front of a courthouse, I realized. It's the way the world rights itself when the monsters try to tilt the scales. I looked out the window at the gardens, the white roses looking like ghosts in the twilight. I looked at the gold band on my right hand, the one Eleanor had given me 40 years ago. The frequency was clear. The noise was gone. The house was quiet, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel empty. I raised my glass to the empty room, to the woman in the photograph, and to the man I had fought so hard to become again. The light faded over the Thorne estate, the shadows stretching long and peaceful across the library floor. I rested my head back against the leather and listened to the silence of a life that was finally, truly mine. The red light on the security panel blinked the steady, peaceful rhythm, a ticking clock that no longer belonged to anyone but me.